June 18, 1944, Camp Hearn, Texas. The heat arrived before the guards did. It pressed down on the wooden tables, on the gravel beneath our shoes, on the backs of our necks where sweat gathered and refused to dry. Texas heat did not rush or shout. It settled in slowly, confidently, like it knew it belonged here. We were marched into the open-air mess area just before noon. No walls, no ceiling, just long wooden tables, rough benches, and a serving line set up under a tin awning that shimmered in the sun. I noticed the smell first. Not soup, not boiled potatoes, not the thin gray steam of wartime kitchens. This was different. Hot fat, soft bread. A faint curl of smoke drifting lazily upward, carrying something rich and unfamiliar with it. The kind of smell that clung to clothing. The kind that lingered. My stomach tightened, not with hunger, but with confusion. When my turn came, the sound reached me before the sight. Metal on metal. A tray sliding forward, a dull clang as something was placed onto it. I looked down. A long, red-pink sausage rested inside a split white roll. The bread looked impossibly soft, pale as fresh paper. It was wrapped loosely in waxed paper, the edges already turning translucent where grease had soaked through. No knife, no fork, no plate. Just this. For a moment, I genuinely thought there had been a mistake. I lifted my eyes to the American soldier behind the counter. He was young, barely older than my brother had been before the war took him. His sleeves were rolled up. His posture was relaxed. He was chewing something himself as he worked, jaw moving slowly, casually. "Hot dog," he said, as if naming a common object, as if I were standing at a fair, not in a prisoner of war camp. Hot dog. The words meant nothing to me. I carried the tray to the table and sat down. Round me, other German women did the same, lowering themselves onto benches with the careful stiffness of people who expected something bad to happen at any moment. No one spoke at first. We stared. At the bread, at the sausage, at the grease pooling faintly in the paper. Finally, someone whispered behind me, barely audible. "Is that food?" I thought the same thing. In Germany, even at the worst moments of the war, food had rules. There were lines, there were portions, there were utensils, even when there was little else. You sat, you waited, you ate carefully. This thing in front of me demanded none of that. It required hands. Across the table, I saw an American guard lean against a post. He held the same thing I did. He lifted it without hesitation and bit straight into it, teeth sinking through bread and meat in one motion. He smiled at something another guard said, grease shining briefly at the corner of his mouth. I felt my chest tighten. This was not how prisoners were fed. This was not how enemies behaved. I had prepared myself for cruelty, for shouting, for humiliation, for being reminded in 100 small ways that we had lost. But no one was shouting. No one was watching us closely. No one seemed afraid of us. The guards talked among themselves. One laughed. Another wiped his hands on a cloth tucked into his belt. A third reached for a bottle of water and took a long drink, tilting his head back toward the sun. They ate like men on a lunch break. That was the shock. Not violence, not punishment, normality. I did not lift the food. I could not. Years of instruction pressed against my mind, sharp and insistent. We had been warned about Americans, about their lack of discipline, about how they treated prisoners, especially women. They would break you first, we were told. Slowly, casually, with smiles. This had to be the beginning of that. I looked around the table. Greta sat rigidly, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the bread as if it might move on its own. Another woman nudged her tray slightly away as though distance might protect her. "Eat," someone whispered, "before they make us." But no one made us. Minutes passed. The heat hummed softly around us. Flies drifted lazily near the tables. Somewhere beyond the fence, a truck engine coughed and then settled into a steady idle. The world did not hold its breath. Nothing dramatic happened. In Europe this same month, Men were dying by the thousands on the beaches of Normandy. Entire cities were shaking under bombs. The war was swallowing everything it touched. And here, in Texas, the smell of cooked meat drifted freely through the air. I did not know it then, but this place existed because of something larger than kindness alone. America was producing at a scale we could barely imagine. Liberty ships slid into the ocean faster than they could be sunk. Factories turned out bombers by the hour. Trucks, uniforms, rifles, boots, everything in numbers that felt unreal. And food. So much food that even prisoners received it without ceremony. Texas ranches stretched farther than my eye could follow. Cattle in numbers that made no sense to someone raised on ration cards and shortages. White bread was not a luxury here. It was ordinary. But sitting at that table, I knew none of this. I knew only what I saw. Men who did not fear us. Food that was not guarded. An enemy who ate the same meal we were given. My fingers trembled slightly as I reached for the waxed paper. It felt warm. Grease touched my skin. Real grease, not watery soup sheen, but something thick and alive. I flinched, surprised by the sensation. This, I thought, is not meant to be eaten politely. This is meant to be eaten. I hesitated, the question forming in my mind before I could stop it. You want us to eat? This? Not with permission, not with gratitude. Just eat. That was when I realized something unsettling. For the first time since my capture, no one was trying to control my fear. And somehow that frightened me more than cruelty ever could, because it meant this moment was real. And if this was real, then everything we had been taught about America might not be, not even close. They told us this was how humiliation began. No one touched the food. That was the strangest part. The hot dogs lay on the trays, steaming faintly in the Texas heat, untouched, like props waiting for a cue that never came. The Americans kept eating, laughing, talking about things we could not understand. And still, no one said a word to us. That silence felt deliberate. I sat there with my hands resting flat on my thighs, back straight, eyes forward, every muscle in my body trained to wait for the moment when kindness would turn into something else. Because this calm, was exactly how we had been warned it would begin. We had been trained for this long before capture. Not formally, not always in classrooms, but steadily, relentlessly through repetition. Through radio broadcasts that crackled through barracks walls at night. Through posters pasted near train stations and factory gates. Through short films shown before newsreels. Always smiling, always confident in their message. The Americans, we were told, lacked discipline. They were loud, undignified, overfed, a nation without culture, without restraint. They mistook abundance for strength and softness for morality. And prisoners, especially enemy prisoners, were not to expect dignity. Humiliation, our instructors said, was their favorite weapon. They would strip you of ceremony first, then of habit, then of self-respect. Food, they warned, would be part of it. They would make you eat like animals, with your hands, without order, without shame. Sitting at that wooden table in Camp Hearn, Texas, I felt those words tighten around my chest like wire, because what I was seeing matched the warning too well. In Germany, even hunger had rules. I remembered dining halls back home, long before the war had devoured everything. White tablecloths, even if they were patched. Cutlery aligned carefully beside plates. The expectation that you sat upright, chewed quietly, waited until everyone had been served. Later, when food grew scarce, the rituals remained. There might be less bread, thinner soup, fewer potatoes, but there was still order, still structure, still the idea that how you ate mattered, even when what you ate barely sustained you. It was one of the last things that made us feel human. Here, none of that existed. The Americans leaned on tables. One guard sat sideways on a bench, one foot propped up casually. Another wiped grease from his fingers onto a napkin and tossed it away without looking. They did not lower their voices in our presence. They did not pause when they laughed. They did not perform restraint for us. And that, more than anything, terrified me. Because if this was intentional, if they meant to show us that manners, ceremony, and order no longer applied, then what came next would be worse. I imagined it clearly. First, they would make us eat this way. Then they would watch. Then they would laugh. They would say, "Look how quickly you forget who you were." That was the humiliation we expected. Across from me, Greta's fingers curled tightly into her skirt. I could see the pulse racing in her neck. She leaned slightly toward me and whispered, barely moving her lips, "Don't touch it yet." I nodded. Not eating felt safer than eating. To refuse was to hold on to something. Control. Choice. The last thin line between us and whatever this was meant to become. Time stretched. The Texas sun climbed higher. Sweat traced slow lines down my spine. A fly landed on the edge of my tray, tasted the grease, and flew away again, unimpressed. Still, no one spoke to us. Still, no one ordered us. That, too, had been predicted. They will pretend not to care, the radio voice had said years ago. They will make you think you still have freedom, until you realize too late that you do not. I forced myself to look beyond the table, past the guards, toward the camp fence. Beyond it lay a world untouched by bombing. No shattered buildings, no blackened walls, no broken windows stuffed with rags, just flat Texas land shimmering in the heat. Somewhere in the distance I could hear the steady rhythm of machinery. Work, production, life continuing without interruption, while Europe burned. That contrast lodged itself in my mind, sharp and painful. In France, cities were being pulverized. In Germany, families huddled in cellars as sirens wailed through the night. Coffee was a memory. Meat, a rumor. White bread, something you dreamed about and then forgot. And here, kitchens ran on schedule. Meat was cooked openly. Bread was sliced generously. Coffee, I would later learn, was brewed every morning without ceremony or apology. Not as a display, not as a message, just as routine. At the time, I could not process that. All I could feel was the tension of waiting for the mask to drop. I watched an American guard walk past our table. He glanced at the untouched food, slowed slightly, then kept going. No sneer, no command, no satisfaction. That unsettled me more than shouting ever could have. If they were not trying to humiliate us, then why had they fed us this way? Why no rules? Why no enforcement? Why did it seem as though they genuinely did not care whether we were impressed, offended, or afraid? The possibility crept in quietly, unwelcome and dangerous. What if this wasn't theater? What if this was simply how they lived? That idea was harder to bear than cruelty. Because cruelty confirmed what we already believed. Normality did not. Normality suggested something deeper, something structural. That American power did not require fear. That it did not depend on ritualized dominance. That it functioned whether we understood it or not. I pushed the thought away. Not yet, I told myself. Don't believe it yet. Belief was the most dangerous thing a prisoner could give up too soon. I looked down at the hot dog again. The waxed paper had softened completely now, warm and slick beneath my fingers. Steam no longer rose from it, but the smell remained. Persistent, inviting, impossible to ignore. My stomach twisted, not with hunger, but with the effort of restraint. This, I realized, was the true test. Not pain, not violence, but whether we would cling to dignity, even when no one seemed interested in taking it from us. They told us this was how humiliation began. And as I sat there, caught between memory and reality, between expectation and evidence, I could not yet tell whether the warning had been right, or whether everything we feared was about to collapse under its own lies. The moment we expected never came. No shouting, no orders, no laughter at our expense. What came instead was something far more unsettling. Time. The Americans finished eating before we did, before we ate at all. Trays scraped lightly against tables. Benches creaked as men stood, stretched, and drifted away in loose clusters. Someone tossed a crumpled napkin into a dented metal trash can. It landed with a hollow clang and stayed there. Life moved on. And still, no one had touched us. I realized then that the silence we had feared was not a trap. It was simply absence, of pressure, of spectacle, of control. One of the guards returned a few minutes later, not to watch us, not to speak. He carried his own food again, unhurried, and this time he sat down at the far end of our table. He did not face us directly. He did not address us at all. He unwrapped his hot dog, folded the wax paper beneath it to catch the grease, carefully, almost habitually, and took a bite. No announcement, no explanation, just a man eating lunch. I felt my pulse quicken. This was not what we had prepared for. He chewed slowly, looking out toward the fence as if lost in thought. After a moment, he reached for a paper cup, drank, wiped his mouth with a brown napkin, and continued eating. The napkin was plain, rough, the kind used everywhere, I would later learn. Diners, kitchens, work sites. He used it once, then again, then folded it and set it beside his tray instead of throwing it away. Waste was not casual here. When he finished, he gathered the wax paper, folded it neatly, and stood. Before leaving, he glanced down the length of the table, not at our faces, but at the untouched food. He paused. Then he said only this, quietly, almost to himself. "It'll get cold." And he walked away. That was all. No demand, no judgment, no follow-up. Just a fact. Something loosened inside me. Not trust, nothing so reckless. But the tight coil of expectation I had carried since capture shifted, just enough to let a breath through. Around me, the others reacted almost imperceptibly. Greta's shoulders dropped a fraction. Another woman adjusted the position of her tray, pulling it a centimeter closer. We exchanged no words. Words felt dangerous. I watched the paper beneath my food darken further as grease soaked into it. My fingers hovered above it, uncertain. This was not an invitation. It was permission. And that difference mattered. I reached out and touched the bread again. It yielded slightly under my fingertips. Still warm. Still soft. The wax paper crinkled faintly. A small, ordinary sound that echoed far too loudly in my head. I expected someone to notice. No one did. The guards nearby talked about something mundane. A truck repair. A letter from home. A place called Oklahoma that meant nothing to me then. No one watched my hands. No one leaned in. I lifted the hot dog. Grease touched my skin again, and this time I did not flinch. Across the table, Greta inhaled sharply when she saw me raise it. Her eyes widened, not in fear, but in something like disbelief. I brought it closer to my face. The smell was stronger now. Meat, salt, bread, not rationed, not measured, not symbolic. Real. I waited for a voice to stop me. None came. So I bit. It was not dramatic. No flood of tears, no collapse, just heat and softness and a weight on my tongue that reminded my body, without asking my permission, what food was meant to do. I chewed slowly, deliberately, half expecting the world to correct me. It didn't. I swallowed. Nothing happened. No laughter, no punishment, no signal that I had failed some test. I took another bite. This time, Greta followed. Then another woman, then another. We ate quietly, not because we were told to, but because it felt suddenly important to do so with care, with attention. The Americans did not react. That, too, mattered. Later, I would understand what I was witnessing. These men, the ones guarding us, feeding us, had grown up in a country shaped by scarcity of a different kind. The Great Depression had taught them hunger early. Not the hunger of siege or bombing, but the long, grinding absence of certainty. They knew what it meant to stretch meals, to save crumbs, to waste nothing. And because of that, food was not a tool to them. It was sustenance. Something you gave because someone needed it, not because you wanted obedience or gratitude in return. I did not know this then. I only knew that no one was trying to own the moment. Kindness here did not arrive with instructions. A guard passed by with a crate of paper cups filled with water. He set it down at the end of the table, nodded once, at no one in particular, and moved on. The water was cool, cold enough to shock my teeth slightly when I drank. Clean, plain, unceremonious. In Germany, water had become something you planned around. Here, it was simply there. The metal trash can filled gradually as people finished eating. Napkins, paper, waxed wrappers, each sound small, each one normal. Normality pressed in from all sides. And with it came a strange, creeping realization. They were not trying to make us less. They were not trying to demonstrate superiority. They were not even trying to convince us of anything. They were simply living their values out loud. I watched an American guard stop himself from throwing away a napkin that still had clean edges. He folded it once, tucked it into his pocket, and walked off. That gesture stayed with me. It was so small, so unremarkable, and yet it told me more about this place than any speech could have. This was not generosity as performance. This was habit, a way of moving through the world shaped by restraint, practicality, and an unspoken belief that dignity did not need to be rationed, not even in wartime, not even toward enemies. We finished eating. No one hurried us. No one praised us. No one commented. When I stood to clear my tray, my legs felt unsteady, not from weakness but from the effort of recalibrating everything I thought I knew. As I dropped the wax paper into the trash, it made the same hollow sound as the others. I remember thinking, absurdly, how ordinary it all felt. That ordinariness was the shock, because nothing in our training had prepared us for an enemy who did not need to humiliate us to feel strong, an enemy who understood that real power could afford to be quiet. No one forced us. And in that absence of force, something inside me shifted, just enough to make room for a dangerous, unfamiliar thought. If this is how they treat prisoners, then who are these people really? The first bite should have ended it. That was what I believed. One bite, then another. The body would remember how to eat. The moment would pass. We would return to ourselves, to control, to the careful distance we had learned to keep from hope. Instead, the opposite happened. The second bite opened something I had sealed away so completely that I had forgotten it existed. The heat of the bread faded, replaced by something else. Memory, rising fast and without permission. Not images at first, sensations. The sound of a kitchen clock ticking, the faint scrape of a chair leg across tile, the smell of onions browning, slowly, patiently, as if there were all the time in the world. I stopped chewing. My hands trembled and I lowered the food back onto the paper, afraid that if I didn't, I would lose control entirely. I was no longer in Texas. I was standing in my mother's kitchen. It was a small room, narrow. The windows faced the street, and in the morning sunlight would fall across the table in a soft rectangle that moved almost imperceptibly as the hours passed. My mother used to chase that light with her work, setting bowls and cutting boards where it landed best. On Sundays, before the war, she cooked without hurry. Bread rested on a wooden board, covered with a cloth to keep it warm. My father read the newspaper aloud, pausing to comment on articles no one else cared about. My younger brother hovered near the stove, waiting for scraps. The world, then, had felt solid, predictable, safe. The smell I carried now, the meat, the bread, had unlocked that room completely. I could see it. I could hear it. I could almost feel the worn edge of the table beneath my fingers. I swallowed hard. The table in front of me blurred. Across from me, Greta made a small sound. Not a sob, not even a gasp. Just a sharp intake of breath, caught halfway in, as if her body had forgotten how breathing was supposed to work. I looked up. Her face had changed. Her eyes were fixed on nothing. Her mouth trembled slightly as if she were trying to say something but could not find the language for it. Then, without warning, tears spilled over, not dramatically, not loudly, but with the quiet inevitability of water breaking through a dam that had held too long. She brought her hand to her mouth, horrified by herself. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I don't know." No one answered her. No one laughed. No one looked away in embarrassment. The table went still. For a moment, the only sounds were the faint hum of insects and the distant clatter of dishes somewhere beyond the serving line. An American guard stood up. My body tensed immediately, instinct overriding reason. He did not raise his voice. He did not approach her directly. He reached instead to a nearby stack and picked up a small bundle of brown paper napkins. He set them down gently on the table, close enough for Greta to reach without standing. Then he stepped back. He did not watch her use them. He did not linger. He turned away as if this were the most ordinary thing in the world. That was when my throat closed completely. I understood then that Greta was not crying because she was hungry. None of us were. We had eaten. Our stomachs were warm, full even. She was crying because the food had reminded her of who she had been before the war decided who she was allowed to be. Because for a few seconds, her body had returned to a time when meals meant family, not survival. When eating did not require courage. I felt it spreading through the table, quiet and contagious. One woman stared down at her hands, blinking rapidly. Another pressed her lips together so tightly they turned white. Someone, further down the bench, covered her face completely, shoulders shaking once before she forced herself still. No one spoke. Speaking would have broken the spell, and the restraint. I took another bite. This time, I did not fight the memory. I let it come. My mother humming softly to herself, unaware she was doing it. My father folding the newspaper with deliberate care, saving it for later. My brother stealing a piece of bread and being scolded gently, never harshly. None of them knew where I was now. I did not know where they were. The last letter I had received described ration lines that stretched for hours. Potatoes counted carefully. Meat replaced by substitutes whose names had changed too often to remember. I imagined them sitting at that same table, thinner now, quieter. I imagined my mother cooking with less, trying to make it feel like more. And here I was, an enemy prisoner, eating food she would not see again for years, if ever. The contrast struck like a physical blow. I lowered my head. A tear fell onto the wax paper. I brushed it away quickly, embarrassed, but the paper absorbed it without comment. Around us, the Americans continued their routines. Some returned to work details. Others leaned against posts, smoking quietly. A truck started in the distance, its engine settling into a steady rhythm. No one gathered to watch us. No one treated our tears as spectacle. That, more than the food itself, undid me. Because in the world I had known, vulnerability was always observed, catalogued, used. Here, it was allowed, and then left alone. The war had taught us that strength was loud, that it demanded acknowledgement, that mercy was something granted publicly, with conditions attached. But what I was seeing here was different. This was restraint, the choice not to look, the choice not to interfere, the choice to let a moment pass without claiming it. I realized dimly that this restraint required confidence. Only someone certain of their position could afford it. When Greta finally lifted her head, her eyes were red but clear. She wiped her face with a napkin, folded it carefully, and placed it beside her tray instead of throwing it away. "I didn't mean to," she said quietly. I shook my head. "Neither did I answered. We shared a look then, not of agreement, but of recognition. Something had broken. Not our discipline, not our resolve. Something else. A barrier we had relied on for protection. I finished the hot dog slowly, deliberately, as if honoring the memory it had awakened. When I was done, I wrapped the wax paper as neatly as I could and carried it to the trash. The hollow sound it made when it landed echoed strangely in my chest. I stood there for a moment, hands resting on the rim of the metal can, grounding myself. This, I told myself, is not weakness. This is grief. And grief, I understood now, was not something the Americans feared. They allowed it to exist, without comment, without punishment. That was its own kind of power. As we filed out of the mess area, no one hurried us. The sun had shifted slightly. The light fell differently across the tables now, softer, less harsh. Behind us, the smell of food lingered. Ahead of us lay the barracks, the fences, the long days of waiting. But something essential had changed. The war had taken many things from us. Homes, families, certainty. What it had not prepared us for was this: to be treated with care at the precise moment we expected to be broken. We didn't cry because of hunger. We cried because, for the first time since our capture, we remembered what it felt like to be human, and realized that our enemy remembered it too. That night, sleep refused to come. The barracks were quiet, but my mind was not. I lay on my bunk staring at the underside of the wooden slats above me, listening to the small sounds of other women turning in their sleep, clearing their throats, breathing unevenly in the dark. The smell of the meal still clung to my hands, not strongly, not obviously, just enough to remind me that it had happened, and that it had mattered. What unsettled me most was not the kindness itself. It was the realization that it had been unnecessary. They didn't have to do this. If the Americans had wanted obedience, there were easier ways to get it. They could have rationed food carefully, making us grateful for every extra bite. They could have used hunger as leverage, as so many armies before them had done. They could have fed us just enough to survive and reminded us daily who controlled the supply. No one would have questioned it. War had lowered expectations everywhere else. But they hadn't. They fed us well, not extravagantly, not ceremonially, but sufficiently, quietly, without spectacle, without demanding anything in return. That distinction mattered, because it meant the meal was not a message. It was a habit. I thought back to the mess area, to the way the guards ate the same food we did, to the way no one monitored our reactions, to the absence of instruction. No lectures about democracy, no warnings about gratitude, no expectation of conversion. They did not ask us to think differently. They simply behaved differently. That was the moment something shifted inside me. This was not kindness as strategy. This was not psychological warfare disguised as generosity. This was a way of life revealing itself under pressure. We had been taught that America was powerful because it was ruthless. What I was beginning to see was something else entirely. America was powerful because it did not need to prove it. Its factories ran day and night, producing more than our minds could grasp. Ships sliding into the ocean faster than reports could track them. Aircraft rolling off assembly lines in numbers that defied belief. But what struck me now was that this industrial might had not hardened them. It had steadied them. They could afford to feed prisoners well because they were not afraid of scarcity. They could afford to be restrained because restraint did not threaten their position. Strength, I realized, looked different here. It did not shout. It did not demand recognition. It did not require humiliation to feel secure. In Germany, power had always been loud. It announced itself constantly, through banners, speeches, uniforms, rituals. It needed affirmation. It needed visibility. Here, power worked quietly in the background. Trucks arrived on schedule. Kitchens opened on time. Coffee was brewed every morning without ceremony. The system did not pause to ask if it was impressive. It simply functioned. And because it functioned, it did not fear us. That realization was deeply unsettling, because it meant the war had not been lost merely on battlefields. It had been lost in ways of thinking. I remembered the American guard who folded his napkin instead of throwing it away. Such a small thing, but it spoke of a generation shaped by hardship and steadied by it. Men who had grown up during the Depression, who understood hunger intimately, but did not romanticize it, who knew waste was wrong, but did not confuse deprivation with virtue. They did not worship suffering. They sought stability, and that stability extended even to their enemies. The next morning, nothing extraordinary happened. Breakfast was served on time. The same routine, the same unremarkable efficiency. No one mentioned the previous day. No one asked how we felt. And that, too, felt intentional. This kindness did not linger. It did not demand to be remembered. It did not follow us, asking to be acknowledged. It existed, and then moved on. I began to understand that this was the truest form of confidence, to act according to your values without waiting for approval. As days passed, the realization deepened. This country did not define victory solely by defeat. It defined it by continuity, by keeping its systems running, its ethics intact, its habits recognizable even under the strain of war. They did not need to humiliate the defeated to feel triumphant. They were already busy building something that extended beyond the war itself. I found myself thinking differently, not about America as an idea, but about Americans as people. People who went home after shifts, who wrote letters to families, who drank coffee in the morning and complained about the heat, who did their jobs without imagining themselves as symbols. This ordinariness, I realized, was not accidental. It was cultivated, and it was powerful. One afternoon, while standing in line for water, I caught myself looking at an American flag hanging near the administrative building. I'd seen it before, of course, countless times, but this time it felt different, not triumphant, not threatening, just present, a marker of continuity rather than conquest. I wondered what it meant to grow up beneath it, what expectations it carried, what quiet obligations it imposed. I wondered how many of the men guarding us had been taught, without words, that strength meant not needing to crush what was already beaten. They didn't have to do this. That sentence returned to me again and again. It became a refrain. They didn't have to offer dignity where none was demanded. They didn't have to preserve humanity when cruelty would have been easier. They didn't have to win this way. But they did. And in doing so, they altered something they could never fully measure. Because the greatest victories are not always claimed on maps or in headlines. Sometimes they are carried quietly by people who return home, remembering not how they were conquered, but how they were treated when they were powerless. That, I understood now, was the difference. And it was why this war, for all its destruction, would leave behind something more enduring than ruins. Not pride in conquest, but pride in restraint. Time does not move forward all at once. It skips. Years passed, then decades, then a lifetime. I left America as a young woman, carrying memories I did not yet know how to name. I returned to a country in ruins, rebuilt a life from fragments, raised children who asked questions I struggled to answer. And still that afternoon in Texas stayed with me. Not vividly, not constantly, but persistently. Like a photograph tucked away in a drawer you do not open often, yet never throw away. 30 years later, America appeared again in my life, this time through a television screen. Black and white images at first, old footage, soldiers returning home, factories roaring back to civilian production, men in work shirts and women in dresses smiling as if relief itself were a shared language. I recognized the posture before I recognized the faces, the steadiness, the quiet confidence of a country that had survived something enormous and believed it could build again. By then, I understood what I had witnessed as a prisoner, that America was not simply victorious, it was cohesive. 50 years passed. My children were grown. The world had changed shape. Borders softened in some places and hardened in others. Technology shrank distances, but not divisions. America, too, had changed. I watched debates grow sharper, voices louder, certainty more brittle. I saw a country that once measured itself by what it could produce begin to argue about what it should be. Factories I remembered from newsreels, steel, ships, engines, became memories themselves. Production moved elsewhere. Pride shifted from making things to managing them. And trust, once assumed, became conditional. I did not judge. I simply noticed, because I had known a different America. 70 years after that meal in Camp Hearn, I visited the United States again, this time as an old woman. The country felt familiar and strange at once, bigger in some ways, faster, louder, more uncertain of itself. People spoke openly about division, about who belonged and who did not, about fear, of the future, of one another, of losing something unnamed. I listened quietly. I thought back to the men who had guarded us. They had not spoken much either. They had worked, eaten, provided, trusted systems they believed in because those systems had proven themselves under pressure. That belief, quiet, shared, almost invisible, had held them together. The America of the 1940s had not been perfect. I knew that. It carried injustices it had yet to confront. It excluded voices it would later learn to hear. It struggled, like all nations do, with contradictions between ideals and reality. But it possessed something rare, a sense of collective direction. People knew what they were sacrificing for, and why. Factories ran because they mattered. Rationing was accepted because it was shared. Discomfort was temporary, purpose was not. That sense of together shaped everything else, even how enemies were treated. The America I see today is different, not weaker, but fragmented. Where once there had been consensus about building, there is now debate about responsibility. Where trust once flowed automatically through institutions, it now pauses, waiting to be earned again and again. People question motives. They doubt systems. They search for reassurance in noise. I understand this. History does not repeat itself kindly, but I cannot help noticing the contrast. When I was a prisoner, America did not ask me to admire it. It simply functioned. Its strength was not displayed. It was assumed. Meals arrived on time. Work was done efficiently. Dignity was preserved without discussion. That quiet competence is harder to find now. Perhaps because it requires agreement. Perhaps because it depends on shared expectations. Perhaps because it cannot survive when everyone insists on being heard at once. I do not ask what America should be. That is not my place. But I wonder, quietly, privately, what happened to the confidence that allowed kindness to exist without explanation? The confidence that made restraint feel natural. The confidence that did not confuse power with performance. When people speak today about nostalgia, they often mean comfort. That is not what I mean. What I remember is not softness. It is resolve. A country willing to invest, to produce, to sacrifice together, and then to treat even its enemies with a dignity that did not weaken it. That combination is rare and fragile. I do not compare to criticize. I compare because memory insists on it. Because once you have seen a nation at its most confident enough to be humane, you cannot help noticing when that confidence wavers, not disappears, just hesitates. What happened to that America? I do not know. Perhaps it evolved. Perhaps it fragmented. Perhaps it simply grew tired. But I know this, that America existed. I sat at its table. I ate its food. I watched it choose restraint when humiliation would have been easier. And that choice, quiet, unrecorded, uncelebrated, outlasted the war itself. That is the legacy I carry. Not an argument, not a demand, just a memory. The war ended. That sentence appears often in books, printed cleanly, as if endings arrive with clarity. But for those who lived through it, the war did not so much end as it loosened its grip. Slowly, unevenly, leaving memories behind that refused to fade. For me, America did not remain a place on a map. It became a story I carried, and eventually a story I passed on. My children grew up hearing fragments of it at first. Not the battles, not the politics. not the ideologies that historians prefer. They heard about a table in Texas, about bread wrapped in waxed paper, about a guard who set down napkins and then looked away. As they grew older, they asked questions. Why did they help you? Why weren't they cruel? Why do you still remember this? I never had a perfect answer. I only knew that gratitude does not require understanding. It requires memory. Years later, letters began to circulate among families like ours, children and grandchildren of former prisoners, reaching across borders that no longer felt permanent. Some letters were short, others careful, handwritten, folded and refolded until the creases softened. They all said the same thing in different ways. We remember, not the guards' names, not the camp numbers, but the way we were treated when we expected the worst. That memory became inheritance. Some of those children came to America. They visited Texas, Wisconsin, small towns whose names meant nothing to history books, but everything to family stories. They stood near old campsites now covered in grass. They walked past diners and grocery stores, past people who had no idea what had once stood there. They did not come as accusers. They came as witnesses, to say, quietly, that kindness had crossed generations, that the way their grandparents were treated had shaped how they themselves understood America, not as an enemy, not as a victor, but as a place where restraint had once been chosen over revenge. I never returned to Camp Hearn. I did not need to. It existed clearly enough in my mind. The table, the heat, the ordinary miracle of being fed without being judged. That memory outlasted the war itself. It outlasted governments. It outlasted ideologies. It outlasted anger. People often ask what lesson should be taken from stories like mine. I do not offer one. Lessons demand agreement. Memories do not. All I know is this. History remembers battles. It remembers dates, strategies, casualties, but families remember something else entirely. They remember who kept them human when they were enemies. The men who fed us did not know our names. They did not imagine themselves as moral examples. They went home after their shifts. They raised families. They aged. Some lived long lives. Some did not. But without intending to, they left something behind. A legacy not of victory, but of conduct. And that legacy traveled farther than any army. If you are listening to this and feel something stir, pride perhaps, or recognition, you do not owe it to me. You owe it to them. To a generation that understood power not as something to display, but as something to control. A generation that believed restraint was not weakness, and kindness was not surrender. A generation that proved a country could win a war without losing itself. Some kindness lasts longer than wars. It survives in stories told quietly at kitchen tables, in letters kept long after the ink has faded. In the way children and grandchildren choose not to hate people they were taught once to fear. That is not history as spectacle. That is history as inheritance. And if this story stays with you, if it makes you pause, remember, or reach for a story of your own, then it has done what those men did that day in Texas. It has reminded us that how a war is fought matters, but how it is remembered matters even more.